The gun was already drawn when Hester Garrison stepped around the corner of the telegraph office, and for one breathless, suspended moment she thought she was about to die in a town she had never even meant to visit. The man holding the weapon was not pointing it at her. He was pointing it at another man entirely, a wiry figure with a crooked mouth and dead eyes who had apparently made the catastrophic mistake of reaching for something concealed beneath his duster coat. The ranger stood with his back partially to Hester, his right arm extended, his whole body coiled like a spring compressed to its absolute limit, and the voice that came out of him was so low and so certain that it seemed to belong to a different order of things than ordinary human speech. "Put it down," Roy Langston said. "Put it down right now, or I will not ask a second time." The wiry man laughed, a sound like dry hinges, and then he looked past Roy's shoulder and saw Hester standing there, and something flickered in those dead eyes that made her stomach turn over completely. She had faced difficult men before. She had crossed half the territory alone in a wagon that had subsequently broken an axle 3 miles outside of Caldwell, Kansas, in the dead of autumn, and she had handled that situation with what she privately considered admirable composure. But the way this man looked at her was something different. It was a calculation, a sudden, terrible arithmetic. "Well now," the wiry man said, "seems like the odds just shifted." Roy moved before the man finished the sentence. He was across the distance between them in 2 long strides, and the pistol in the wiry man's hand discharged into the dirt at exactly the moment Roy's forearm came down across his wrist, with the kind of precise, controlled force that suggested it had been done many times before. The crack of the shot sent horses screaming along the main street of Caldwell, and people dove through doorways, and Hester pressed herself flat against the rough-hewn boards of the telegraph office wall and discovered that her hands were shaking. She had not been shaking until just that moment. It seemed important somehow that the shaking had waited until it was over. The wiry man was on the ground with his face in the dust and Roy's knee between his shoulder blades, and Roy was saying something to him in that same low, certain voice, while he bound his wrists with a leather cord he had produced from somewhere on his person. A badge glinted on Roy's chest in the late afternoon light, the silver star of a Texas Ranger, though they were in Kansas now, and the jurisdiction was a complicated matter that Hester did not entirely understand and did not, at this particular moment, have the mental resources to examine. It was only after the wiry man had been hauled to his feet and walked at gunpoint toward the sheriff's office that Roy Langston turned around and saw her. He went very still. She went very still. They stood there in the long shadow of the telegraph office with the sound of spooked horses gradually subsiding and the smell of spent powder drifting between them, and something happened in that moment that Hester Garrison could not have named accurately, only felt, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. She needed to understand how they had arrived at this moment. She needed to go back to the beginning of the day, which had started so simply and so wretchedly, and trace the thread from there to here, because otherwise none of it would make sense. She had left the boarding house in Wichita 17 days ago. That was where the story really began, not with guns and not with silver badges, and not with a man who looked at her like she had answered a question he had not known he was asking. It began with a letter, and a lie, and a broken promise that had cost Hester Garrison everything she had spent 3 years building. Her brother James had written to her from a homestead near a settlement called Broken Creek, which sat approximately 40 miles southwest of Caldwell in the rolling grassland country that was neither properly Kansas nor properly Indian Territory, but occupied the uncomfortable space between both. James had been filing a land claim, and the claim had finally been approved, and he had asked Hester to come west and help him establish the homestead properly before winter closed in. He had a small cabin already constructed, he wrote. He had a well dug. He had a team of horses and a milk cow and enough seed grain stored for the following spring. He needed her particularly because he had contracted a chest ailment that the local physician had treated, but which had left him weakened, and there was more labor required than one person could manage alone before the cold came. Hester had been working as a seamstress in Wichita, where she had arrived after her own situation in St. Louis had fallen apart in a way she did not like to dwell on for too long. A man named Gerald Ashworth had been involved, and a promise of marriage that turned out to be a promise made simultaneously to 3 other women in 3 other cities. A revelation that had arrived via a letter from a stranger with a very sympathetic tone and a very devastating message. Gerald Ashworth had vanished before any of the 4 women could properly express their feelings about the matter, and Hester had left St. Louis shortly after because the city had begun to feel like a place where her humiliation had taken permanent physical form and stood on every street corner. She was 26 years old when she boarded the train west. She was not bitter. She told herself very firmly that she was not bitter, and she mostly believed it, except in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the enforced honesty of sleeplessness made certain truths unavoidable. What she was, more accurately, was careful. She had become very careful. She had built her life in Wichita around things that could not lie to her: needle and thread, fabric and pattern, the clean geometry of a well-executed seam. She had made friends but kept them at a comfortable distance. She had received 2 proposals of marriage in the 3 years she spent in Wichita, and had declined both of them with a politeness that left no room for misunderstanding. She was not, she told herself, closed to the idea of love. She simply required evidence before she extended trust, and evidence took time, and time in the Wild West of 1879 was a commodity that circumstances rarely allowed in sufficient quantity. James's letter had seemed like exactly the right kind of opportunity: work she understood, family she trusted, a purpose that would carry her through to spring, and then she would reassess. She had packed her 2 good dresses, her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, and a small but meaningful amount of cash money into a trunk that was too heavy for her to lift alone, and she had arranged passage on a freight wagon heading southwest out of Wichita in the company of a freighter named Caldwell Pete, which was not his given name, but was the only name anyone seemed to use for him. The wagon's left rear wheel had developed a crack in the felloe somewhere around the 14th mile out of Caldwell, which was itself a day's travel from Wichita, and the crack had progressed to a full fracture on the 15th mile, and on the 16th mile, the wheel had simply declined to continue participating in the journey and had deposited itself, and the corner of the wagon it supported directly into the red Kansas earth. Caldwell Pete had been admirably philosophical about the situation. He had unhitched one of the horses, loaded what he needed, told Hester that Caldwell was close enough that she could walk it, and had ridden back the direction they had come from without much further ceremony. He had not been unkind. He had simply been practical in the way that the frontier demanded practicality, which was a practicality that occasionally looked, from certain angles, like abandonment. Hester had looked at her trunk, which she could not carry, and then at the road ahead of her, which stretched through the grassland like a pale scar, and had made a series of decisions that she considered reasonable given the circumstances. She would walk to Caldwell. She would send a wire to James explaining the delay. She would arrange for someone to retrieve her trunk. She would find a way to continue to Broken Creek, because that was what the situation required, and she had grown very good at doing what situations required. The walk had taken longer than Caldwell Pete's estimation suggested it should have. The prairie wind that came off the open grassland at that time of year had a personality that was not friendly, and the sky in the northwest had developed a particular shade of steel gray that she associated, from her childhood in Ohio, with serious weather. By the time the low profile of Caldwell materialized on the horizon, her feet were protesting loudly inside her boots. The wind had reached a velocity that required active leaning to navigate, and the first few drops of rain had begun to fall with a cold deliberateness that suggested they were advance scouts for something considerably worse. She had arrived at the edge of the town's main street, just as the wind picked up hard enough to send her hat skimming away across the grass like a startled bird. She had watched it go with a feeling she refused to characterize as despair. It had been a good hat. The main street of Caldwell in the autumn of 1879 was a busy, functional, unpretty place. It had a general store, a hotel, a land office, a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a livery stable, a sheriff's office, a small church, and a collection of other buildings in various states of completion. It also had on its main thoroughfare quite a lot of horses and wagons and people moving in different directions with different urgencies, and Hester had stood at the edge of it all feeling the first serious conviction that she might be more lost than she had admitted to herself. She needed directions. Not to Caldwell, she was in Caldwell. She needed directions to Broken Creek, which she understood lay to the southwest but whose precise location, relative to the roads and trails that existed in this particular territory, she did not know. She had a map, but the map had been drawn by someone whose relationship with scale was, at best, aspirational, and it had gotten wet in the last 100 yards of her walk so that the ink had begun to migrate in ways that made it less useful than it had been. She had been standing at the edge of the street, studying the blurred map with the increasing rain beginning to work itself into a proper downpour, when a man on a tall gray horse had come around the corner of the telegraph office, looked at her and said, "Ma'am, you look like someone who needs help and doesn't particularly want to ask for it." She had looked up from the map. He had been, she noted with the detached part of her mind that was always cataloging details for later use, an exceptionally good-looking man in a way that she immediately distrusted. Not beautiful in the way that Gerald Ashworth had been beautiful, which was a beauty that turned out to be the most accessible and misleading surface of a profound interior emptiness. This was something different. This was a face that looked like it had been tested and had passed. Strong jaw, dark eyes that were not quite brown and not quite green, a mouth that was shaped for frankness rather than charm, and the kind of sun-scored skin that meant someone who spent their days in open country. The Silver Ranger's star on his chest caught the gray light. "I have a map," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It appears to be dissolving." She looked down at the paper in her hands, which was, in fact, releasing its ink into the rain at an accelerating pace, and she had said something that she would later be slightly embarrassed about, which was, "I need to get to Broken Creek." "Broken Creek," he repeated. He had dismounted from the gray horse with the kind of ease that spoke of 10,000 repetitions, and he held the reins lightly in one hand and looked at her with an expression that was entirely serious and somehow also kind. "That's 40 miles southwest of here, mostly off-road through open range. You planning to walk that too?" She had been about to answer when the situation in the alleyway beside the telegraph office had erupted, and the wiry man had materialized with his pistol, and everything had compressed into the sequence of events that had brought them to the present moment, standing in the damp air of the Caldwell Main Street with the smell of rain and spent powder mixing together, and neither of them quite certain what to say. "You're all right," Roy Langston said. It was not entirely a question and not entirely a statement. It existed somewhere in the territory between them. "Yes," Hester said. Her hands had stopped shaking. "Yes, I am perfectly fine, thank you." "That man," he said, "is someone I have been looking for. He's connected to a robbery of a Union Pacific freight car outside of Dodge City last month. 3 men were hurt. He was not supposed to be in Caldwell, which means someone told him I was here." Hester blinked. "You're telling me this because you were in the line of that situation," he said, "and you deserve to understand what it was." He paused. "And because I interrupted your question about directions, and that wasn't courteous." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was coming down properly now, and the main street had emptied out somewhat as people sought shelter, and the two of them stood in the increasing downpour in what was beginning to feel like a conspicuously private pocket of the day. "Roy Langston," he said, and extended his hand. Hester Garrison, she said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief and honest. She noted with the careful part of herself that she had made a note of its honesty, which was a thing she had not done with a handshake in a very long time. Broken Creek, he said, releasing her hand and looking at the sky with a practiced eye. I know the road, all the roads actually. I've been ranging this territory for the better part of 6 years. Is there a stage line, a freighter heading that direction? Not today, he said. Weather's closing in. There'll be nothing moving southwest today, probably not tomorrow either. You'll need to stay in town tonight at minimum. He looked back at her, and there was something careful in his expression that she recognized as something close to what she herself felt most of the time, which was the look of a person who had learned to examine things before trusting them. I have business I need to complete with the sheriff here. It'll take a couple of hours. After that, I'm riding southwest myself. I can take you to Broken Creek. I couldn't impose, she said. You're not imposing, he said. It's the road I'm taking. She wanted to say that she was perfectly capable of arranging her own passage, because she had been arranging her own passage through a world that was frequently disinterested in her welfare for the better part of 3 years, and she had managed. But the rain was now thoroughly committed to its purpose, and her dress was soaked, and her map was a ruin, and the man standing in front of her had just disarmed a criminal with a precision and economy that suggested he was very good at his particular work, and there was something in his voice that she found, despite every instinct she had cultivated, impossible to disbelieve. I need to send a wire first, she said. To my brother. Telegraph office is right behind you, he said. I'll see you in 2 hours at the hotel dining room. We'll eat before we ride. He had already turned toward the sheriff's office before she could formulate a response, leading the gray horse by the reins, and she stood in the rain and watched him go, and she thought, I am going to be very careful about this particular person. She thought it very firmly. She also noticed, with the clinical detachment that she had been carefully maintaining for 3 years, that she had to think it quite firmly, which meant something. The telegraph office was warm and smelled of kerosene. The operator, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a professional incuriosity about the content of the messages he processed, tapped out her message to James without comment. She composed it briefly. Arriving delayed, staying Caldwell overnight, expect me in 2 days, health good, love Hester. She did not mention Roy Langston because there was nothing to mention. He was a ranger providing professional courtesy to a stranded traveler. That was all. The hotel dining room at 6:30 in the evening was warm and crowded and smelled of beef stew and wood smoke, and Roy was already there when she arrived, having clearly made some effort toward presentability that she found unexpectedly affecting. He had removed the dust of the road in some fashion, and his dark hair was damp at the temples in a way that suggested a recent encounter with a wash basin, and he rose when she came in, which was a courtesy she had not expected and which landed somewhere it was not supposed to. I ordered coffee, he said. Hope that's all right. Coffee is excellent, she said, and sat down across from him and thought, I am being careful. The stew came, and the cornbread and the coffee, and they ate for a few minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her because she had expected discomfort, had counted on it as a kind of buffer. You're going to Broken Creek to see your brother, he said. Yes, James Garrison. He has a land claim there. He's been ill. I know of him, Roy said. Not well. I passed through Broken Creek maybe 4 months ago. Small settlement, maybe 30-40 people. There's a general store and a post office. The land around it is good grassland, suitable for cattle, some farming in the creek bottoms. You know the whole territory this thoroughly. That's the work, he said simply. A ranger who doesn't know his territory is a ranger who gets people killed. She looked at him over her coffee cup. How long have you been a ranger? Since I was 22, he said. I'm 28 now. He was 2 years older than her then. She had been estimating somewhere in that range and found the confirmation settled something quietly. "You said the man from this afternoon was someone you'd been looking for," she said. "He knew you were in Caldwell." Something moved across Roy's face, a shadow she might have missed if she had been less attentive. "Yes," he said, "which means I have a problem I've been aware of for a while. Someone in the Ranger organization is communicating my movements to the people I'm hunting. I don't know who. I don't know why. But this is the third time I've been in a situation where someone I was tracking knew exactly where I'd be." "That's a dangerous situation," she said. "A betrayal from within." "It is," he said. "And until I know the source, I'm working alone and telling no one where I'm going." He paused and looked at her directly. "Which is why I'm heading to Broken Creek tomorrow. There's a man there I need to speak with, related to the Dodge City robbery." She set down her coffee cup. "You're not just being courteous," she said. "You're going there anyway." "I told you I was," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean." She studied him. The particular quality of the silence between them in the dining room, with the rain working at the windows and the other diners absorbed in their own conversations, had the intimate texture of a much longer acquaintance. She did not know what to make of that. She was not sure she trusted it. "I appreciate the honesty," she said carefully. "I want you to know that I'm not someone who extends trust easily." "All right," he said, without defensiveness. "That seems like a reasonable position. I'm just saying it so it's understood from the start." "Understood," he said, and something in the way he said it, not wounded, not dismissive, just accepting it as a fact she had offered him, made her feel a complicated thing that she put firmly to one side. They rode out of Caldwell the next morning before full sunrise, when the rain had passed and left the world smelling of wet grass and iron-cold air, and the sky was the color of a bruise healing at its edges. Roy was on the gray horse, whose name she had learned was Pilgrim, a name she found both ironic and touching. He had arranged for her a reliable bay mare from the livery, a steady animal with a white stripe down her face whom the liveryman called Tuesday, and her trunk had been left with the hotel keeper for retrieval later. The road southwest out of Caldwell dissolved into trail within the first 5 miles, and the trail itself grew less reliable after that, threading through the rolling grassland by means of established wagon ruts that were, in several places, difficult to distinguish from the general landscape. Roy rode slightly ahead, not because he was leading her, but because he was watching the country, scanning the horizon and the tree lines along the creek bottoms with the systematic attention of someone who had survived long enough in this work to understand that the landscape communicated constantly if you knew how to listen to it. She watched him watch it. She could not help it. There was something about the quality of his attention that was entirely different from anything she associated with the dangerous charm of men who wanted something from her. He was not performing. He was simply doing his work, and his work required this total, unself-conscious engagement with the world around him, and she found it, against her considerable resistance, beautiful in the plain way that functional things are beautiful. "Tell me about Broken Creek," she said, drawing level with him on a flat stretch where the trail was clear enough not to require active navigation. "Small," he said. "Growing. People there are mostly from Missouri and Tennessee originally. Hard workers. There's some tension with the cattle outfits that use the open range, because the homesteaders are starting to fence, and the ranchers don't like it. You may find that's a topic your brother has feelings about." "James has feelings about most topics," she said, and Roy smiled at that. A quick, genuine thing that was there and then gone, like a card shown and replaced in a deck. "The man I need to speak with at Broken Creek is named Arlen Fitch," he said. "He runs the general store there. I have reason to believe he received goods from the freight car that was robbed, possibly without knowing their origin. I need to know who sold them to him and what they looked like. You think the goods are still there?" "No, but Fitch will remember faces if I ask him the right questions." They rode in silence for a while, and then she said, "You said someone in the Ranger organization is communicating your movements. That must make it hard to trust anyone." He was quiet for a moment. "It makes it lonely," he said, and then seemed to catch himself slightly as though he had said more than he intended. She looked sideways at him. He was looking at the horizon. "I know something about that," she said. "The not trusting." "I expect you do," he said. He did not ask why, and she found that she wanted to tell him anyway, which was unusual enough to be worth examining. "I was engaged once," she said. "In St. Louis. He was engaged to 3 other women simultaneously. I was the last one to find out." Roy turned to look at her. His expression did not have pity in it, which she would have found unbearable. It had a steady, direct acknowledgment that she found she could withstand. "That's a serious thing," he said. "A profound betrayal." "Yes," she said, "it was." "And yet you're here," he said, "riding across the Kansas grassland alone, going to help your brother. That's not what a person does when they've been broken." She considered that. "I was careful to choose a situation I could trust," she said. "Family. Work I know how to do. Nothing that required me to extend faith beyond what I could afford to lose." He nodded slowly. They crossed a shallow creek, water still running high and fast from the rain, and Pilgrim and Tuesday picked their way through it with the careful deliberation of experienced trail horses. On the far bank, the grassland opened out into a long, golden sweep that rolled all the way to a horizon where the sky was finally fully blue and wild-looking. "My father was a ranger," Roy said. "He was killed when I was 17. There was a man he trusted in his own company who was passing information to an outlaw gang in exchange for money. My father walked into an ambush because of it. He was the best man I ever knew, and he died because someone he considered a brother chose betrayal for the price of a few $100s. She understood then why he had told her about the mole in his organization with the directness he had. It was not just information. It was the shape of his own dark past, the wound that had been driving him forward for 11 years with the velocity that only loss can generate. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They did not speak for a while after that, but the silence had changed. It had taken on a different quality, the quality of 2 people who had shown each other something real and found, against all expectation, that the other person handled it without flinching. They stopped at midday on a low rise overlooking a creek bottom thick with cottonwood trees that were going gold in the autumn light. Roy had packed provisions with the systematic thoroughness that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, and they ate salt crackers and dried beef and a couple of hard-boiled eggs that the hotel kitchen had produced, and drank water from his canteen, and the whole thing had the easy, unforced quality of 2 people who had been sharing meals for years rather than hours. "You said you've been ranging this territory for 6 years," she said. "Do you have a home base? Somewhere you go between assignments?" "I have a room in Wichita," he said. "I'm in it maybe 30 days a year, if that. That's a very solitary life." "Yes," he said, "it is." He looked at her with that direct gaze that she was having increasing trouble finding a defense against. "Does that concern you?" She was quiet for a moment, aware that the question had more than one layer. "Why would it concern me?" she said carefully. He did not answer immediately. He looked out over the golden cottonwoods and the creek gleaming at the bottom of the slope, and when he spoke his voice had the deliberate quality of someone choosing words with precision. "Because I am not stupid, Miss Garrison," he said, "and I do not believe you are either. And there is something happening in this particular 2 days of riding together that I think we are both aware of, and I am not someone who pretends otherwise." She felt her heart do something that it had not done in 3 years, a kind of sudden, complicated leap that she had missed and feared and was not at all sure what to do with. "I have been very careful," she said, "about exactly this kind of thing." "I know," he said. "I can see you being careful. It's one of the most compelling things I've ever observed." That surprised a small laugh out of her, which surprised her further. "That seems like a very strange thing to say." "I expect it does," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she was already beginning to catalog with the careful attentiveness of someone memorizing something they do not want to lose. "But I mean it. You have built yourself into something very strong, and you are in the process of deciding whether that strength requires solitude or whether it can afford to include another person. I find that an interesting thing to watch." She looked at him. You're remarkably perceptive for a man who spends most of his time alone in the grassland. Solitude is good for observation, he said. When you're alone for extended periods, you start to understand human behavior better because you have the distance to see it clearly. It's when we're immersed in company that we miss most of what's actually happening. She thought about that. She thought about Gerald Ashworth and how she had been so immersed in the warmth of his attention that she had missed every signal that would have told her the truth if she had been further back from it. She thought about the 3 years in Wichita, the careful distance she had maintained, the clear sight it had given her. "I've been at a distance for 3 years," she said. "I can see a great deal clearly from here." "What do you see?" he asked. His voice was quiet now, and it had the quality of someone who genuinely wanted the answer. She looked at him for a long moment in the autumn light, with the wind moving through the cottonwoods below them and the smell of the grassland all around them, and she said, "Someone who tells the truth even when it would be easier not to." Something changed in his expression at that. Not dramatically, not in the way that dramatic things announce themselves, but with the deep, quiet shift of something that had been held in tension for a long time beginning to release. "That's what I am trying to be," he said. "I can't always claim I succeed." "The trying matters," she said, and then they both fell quiet, and the afternoon moved around them, and she was aware that she was in the middle of something that was considerably more significant than directions. They reached Broken Creek as the sun was dropping to the level of the western horizon, painting everything in amber and copper, and a red so deep it seemed to come from inside the grass itself. The settlement materialized from the grassland, the way small frontier towns always did. First a smudge of smoke, then the dark verticals of buildings against the sky, then the details assembling themselves one by one as distance closed. James Garrison's homestead was at the eastern edge of the settlement, a quarter-mile off the main track on a slight rise above the creek, and the cabin was exactly as he had described it in his letter, small but solid, with a proper stone chimney, and a lean-to shed for the horses and a kitchen garden that was still producing a few late vegetables in the cold-tempered soil. James himself met them at the gate, and he was clearly not as recovered as he had implied. He was thin in a way that spoke of weeks of poor appetite, and the color in his face was wrong, and he leaned slightly on the gate post in a way that he was probably hoping they would not notice. He was 30 years old and looked at this moment closer to 45, but his eyes were sharp and warm, and his smile when he saw Hester was entirely James, entirely the brother who had taught her to fish in the river behind their childhood home in Ohio and who had cried at their mother's funeral without any self-consciousness whatsoever. "Hester," he said, "thank God. I was starting to worry." "I'm here," she said, and embraced him carefully, aware of how light he felt under her hands. "The wagon broke down. It's a long story." James looked over her shoulder at Roy, standing a respectful distance back with Pilgrim and Tuesday on long leads, and then he looked back at Hester with an expression she recognized as the expression he always wore when he was trying to make sense of a new variable in his understanding of the world. "This is Roy Langston," she said, "Texas Ranger. He was riding this direction and offered to make sure I arrived safely." "Grateful for it," James said, extending his hand as Roy came forward. They shook, and James studied Roy with the same direct attentiveness that Hester was beginning to understand ran in their family. "Come inside," James said. "I have a pot on the fire." The inside of the cabin was a bachelor's home in the way that frontier bachelor homes always were, functional and clean but with nothing spare, nothing decorative, nothing that did not serve a direct and obvious purpose. Hester's eyes went immediately to the corners where it was clear some of James's management had slipped during the illness, and she began making mental notes with the automatic efficiency of someone who has organized other people's domestic chaos before. Roy stayed for supper, though Hester noticed that he was watchful through the meal, his eyes going occasionally to the windows, his posture never entirely releasing the readiness that seemed to be his resting state. After they had eaten, he excused himself with a courtesy that was completely natural and not in the least performative, and James watched him go out to see to the horses with an expression that Hester chose to ignore. "He's a ranger," she said preemptively. "Yes," James said, "I can see the badge. He has business here, in the settlement." "Of course he does," James said. "Hester." "James." There was a brief, fraternal silence that contained about 15 years of conversational shorthand. "You've known him a day and a half," James said. "I'm aware of that." "You're looking at him the way you looked at the Whitmore boy when we were 17, James said, "which is fine. What concerns me is that I don't think you're aware that you're doing it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The Whitmore boy was a disaster. He was a disaster in every other way, but that's not the point, and you know it. The point is you were open then, before everything with that man in St. Louis closed you down. And now you're looking at this ranger with that same openness, but because you think you're being careful, you can't see yourself doing it." She looked at the fire in the stove grate and thought about that. That's a very insightful observation for someone who's been spending too much time alone on 160 acres of Kansas grassland. "Solitude is good for the thinking faculties," James said, with a dry smile that reminded her of their father. Roy came back in from the horses, and they spent another hour talking with James about the homestead and the settlement and the work that needed doing before winter, and then Roy stood and said he needed to find accommodation in the settlement, and James told him that the Fitch General Store had a room above it that was rented out sometimes, and something moved behind Roy's eyes at the mention of Fitch's name. "Much obliged," he said. At the door he turned and looked at Hester, and there was a very brief, very clear thing that passed between them that was not complicated and not subtle. "I'll likely be in the settlement for a few days," he said. "Working." "I'll be here," she said. "Working as well." "Yes," he said. "I expect you will." He went out into the autumn night, and she heard the sound of pilgrims' hooves moving away through the dark, and she stood at the closed door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The next 2 days were full of the practical labor of a homestead that had been partially neglected. Hester cleaned and organized and cooked and mended, and took stock of the root cellar and the woodpile, and the state of the stable with the systematic competence that was her gift. James worked alongside her for as much of the day as his health allowed, which was perhaps 4 or 5 hours before exhaustion required him to stop, and Hester did not comment on this directly, but arranged the work so that the lighter tasks were available during those hours, and the heavier ones during the hours when she worked alone. On the afternoon of the second day, she took the bay mare into the settlement for supplies and found Roy at the general store, standing at the counter in conversation with a heavy-set man of perhaps 50 with white side whiskers and a prosperous, comfortable manner that sat slightly at odds with the worried set of his eyes. Arlen Fitch, she understood. Roy looked up when she came in, and the simple fact of his face doing what it did when she entered a room was something she was now committed to accepting as information rather than defending against. She made her purchases efficiently, and as she was leaving, Roy followed her out onto the porch of the store and stood beside her in the low afternoon light. "How is he?" he asked. He meant James. "Improving," she said. "He needs time and food and less exertion than he's been subjecting himself to. He'll be all right." She paused. "Did Fitch tell you what you needed to know?" Roy leaned against the porch post and looked out at the main track of the settlement, where a couple of children were chasing a chicken with the committed investment of childhood. "Enough," he said. "He received goods from a man named Billy Krause, who presented them as salvage from a wagon wreck. The description Fitch gave me matches a man who was seen in Dodge City the night before the robbery. So I have a name now, and I have a description confirmed, and I need to get word to a ranger captain I trust implicitly who is stationed in Abilene. Will you ride there?" "I'll wire from here," he said. "The post office has a telegraph, and then I'll wait for a response because I don't want to move on Krause alone without backup." "How long will that take?" He looked at her. "Maybe a week," he said. "Maybe less." She understood what he was telling her in the gaps of what he said, that he was not in a hurry to leave, that a week in Broken Creek was not, in his assessment, a hardship. James mentioned that the Petersons 2 miles south of his claim are looking for someone to help with their fencing, she said. The husband hurt his shoulder. I thought if you needed occupation while you wait, they'd probably appreciate an extra pair of hands. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression that she was beginning to be unable to look away from. You're finding me a way to stay useful, he said. I'm passing along information, she said. What you do with it is your concern. Hester, he said. Her name in his voice had a quality she had not anticipated. Not soft, not sentimental, but direct. The way everything about him was direct, as though saying her name was a thing he took seriously. Roy, she said. They stood on the porch of Fitch's General Store in the October afternoon light of the Kansas grassland, and the children continued to pursue the chicken, and somewhere down the track someone was hammering something, and the moment extended itself with a kind of luminous unhurriedness that was entirely at odds with the velocity of everything that had preceded it. I am not a simple proposition, he said. I want to be honest about that. This work I do, it doesn't leave a great deal of room. I travel constantly. I face genuine danger. I have an unknown enemy inside my own organization. These are not things I can pretend away. I didn't ask you to, she said. No, he said. You didn't, that's why I'm telling you anyway. She considered him. She considered herself, which was harder. She considered the 3 years of careful distance, and James's observation about the way she looked at this man without knowing she was doing it, and the conversation on the rise above the creek bottom where they had each shown the other a wound and neither had flinched. I am not a simple proposition either, she said. I have very carefully constructed defenses that I am going to spend considerable energy trying to maintain even when part of me doesn't want to, because that's what 3 years of habit looks like. And it doesn't dissolve in 2 days just because something feels different than anything has felt in 3 years. That seems honest, he said. I'm trying to be, she said. He smiled then, the full smile, not the brief quick thing she had seen before but the real one, and it changed his whole face in a way that she felt somewhere beneath her ribs. Then let's be honest together and see where that goes, he said. She said, that seems like a reasonable proposition. He helped the Petersons with their fencing, as it turned out, because Roy Langston was precisely the kind of man who saw work that needed doing and did it without being asked twice. He spent 3 days riding out to the Peterson claim in the mornings and returning to Broken Creek in the evenings. And on 2 of those evenings, he came to James's homestead for supper. And James watched the 2 of them with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and the particular vigilance of an older brother whose illness had not in any way diminished his capacity for protective observation. On the 4th evening, Roy and Hester walked along the creek after supper, which was entirely proper because the light lasted long enough, and James could see the track from the cabin window, and they talked for 2 hours about everything, and nothing in the way that only happens when 2 people have found the specific frequency on which their minds operate most naturally. She told him about her life in Wichita, the clients whose lives came through in the clothes they asked her to make, the widow who ordered 3 dresses the week after her husband died, all of them in lighter colors than anything she had worn during the marriage. He told her about the places he had ridden through in 6 years of ranging, the Llano Estacado in its terrifying, flat enormity, the breaks of the Canadian River, the Cedar Hills south of the Brazos, and the way the spring came to the southern plains in a wave of wildflowers so dense and vivid that the first time he had seen it as a young ranger he had stopped his horse and simply stared for 10 minutes, which was something he had never told anyone before. She thought about that, about him at 22 on a horse in the middle of a field of spring wildflowers, stopped in his tracks by beauty. She thought about it a great deal. The man inside your organization, she said. The one passing your location to criminals. Do you have a suspicion? He was quiet for a moment. They were sitting on the bank above the creek, which was running low in the autumn, and the water made a quiet, continuous sound over the stones. "I have a suspicion," he said. "I am not ready to name it yet, because if I name it wrong, I will destroy someone's reputation who doesn't deserve it, and if I name it right, I need to be certain enough that I can move on it with full conviction." "That's a very uncomfortable position to occupy," she said. "It's been uncomfortable for about 2 years," he said. "Since my captain started sending me on assignments that seemed to generate a pattern of forewarning. I've been watching the pattern, accumulating evidence. The man in Caldwell was supposed to be the confirmation I needed, but he knew I was coming, which means my captain told someone, and now I'm back to eliminating candidates." "Your captain could be the source himself," she said. Roy looked at her. "Yes," he said. "He could be." "That would be a particularly devastating betrayal," she said. "Given what happened to your father." He said nothing for a moment. "Yes," he finally said, "it would." She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, which was resting on his knee, and she felt him go very still in the way of a person who is not accustomed to being touched gently and does not quite know what to do with the experience. "I'm sorry," she said, "that you've been carrying that alone." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then he turned his arm and took her hand in his, and held it with the same quality of careful, honest attention he brought to everything. And she let him, and the creek moved over its stones in the darkening evening, and the situation was no longer something she was defending against. It was something she was choosing. The wire back from the captain Roy trusted in Abilene came on the 6th morning, and it was not the response Roy had expected. Hester was in the general store when he came in with the paper in his hand, and she knew from the set of his face that the news was significant. "Captain Morris in Abilene confirms that there are 2 other rangers who have been tracking this same operation independently," he said, keeping his voice low. "And they have a name for the source inside the organization." He paused. "It's not my captain. It's a clerk in the administrative office in Austin, a man named Doyle, who has access to Ranger movement records and has been selling them for 2 years. Morris has arrested him." She felt something release in his posture as he said it, something that had been braced against a particular weight for a long time, and she understood that part of what had been released was the fear that it might have been his captain, the person who was supposed to be something like a father, and the relief that this particular dark history was not about to repeat itself. "It's over," she said quietly. "That part of it," he said. "Kraus is still at large. But I have a name, a description confirmed, and now I have the full weight of the organization behind me instead of working around it." He looked at her. "I need to ride to Abilene in the next few days. Meet with Morris, coordinate the search for Kraus properly." She nodded, she understood. "And then," he looked at her with that direct gaze that she had completely stopped trying to deflect. "And then I'll come back," he said, "if that's acceptable." "It's acceptable," she said. He left the next morning on Pilgrim, and Hester stood at James's gate and watched them go, the gray horse and the ranger with the silver star, and James stood beside her and said nothing for once, which was its own form of commentary. The 2 weeks that followed were busy in the way that frontier autumn is always busy, with the urgency of winter preparation driving every day from first light to last. Hester threw herself into it with the particular energy of someone who is choosing to be fully present in their immediate work rather than monitoring the horizon constantly, which was itself a form of the bravery she was discovering she was capable of. She patched the cabins chinking against the coming cold. She organized the root cellar. She helped James repair the roof of the Linta shed and rendered tallow for candles and preserving, and taught him, with considerable patience, how to make a bread that did not emerge from the oven with the density of a river stone. James improved steadily. The food and rest and having Hester there did something for him that medicine alone had not, and by the end of the first week he was spending full days at work again, and the color had returned to his face, and he was the James she remembered from before the illness, opinionated and energetic, and prone to long digressions on the subject of Kansas land law. She did not tell him about her hand in Roy's hand by the creek. But she thought about it at night, with the wind working at the cabin walls and the smell of prairie cold coming under the door. And she thought about Roy riding across the long grassland toward Abilene and what he had said about coming back. And she thought about bravery and how it was different from recklessness, how it required you to have genuinely assessed the risk before you accepted it. She had assessed the risk. She had assessed it very thoroughly, with the careful, attentive intelligence that she had spent 3 years sharpening in the service of her own protection. Roy Langston was not a risk in the way that Gerald Ashworth had been a risk. Gerald Ashworth had been a mirror that showed you only what you wanted to see. Roy was a window, clear and unadorned, and what you saw through him was the actual landscape of who he was, difficult terrain in places, lonely in others, scarred by an old wound that had never quite closed, but authentic, every inch of it authentic, and she had spent enough time with mirrors to know the difference. He came back in 17 days, not 14. The extra 3 were explained by the wire he sent on the 15th day, which reached her at Broken Creek's post office and said simply, "Kraus located, in custody, back when I can, Roy." She read it twice and smiled in the post office in a way that made the postmaster look at her with polite curiosity that she did not bother to explain. He rode in on a Wednesday afternoon when Hester was in the kitchen garden picking the last of the winter squash before the hard freeze that was clearly 2 or 3 days away. She heard Pilgrim before she saw him, that particular 4-beat cadence on the hard ground, and she stood up from where she was crouching between the squash plants with dirt on her hands and a squash under her arm and turned around, and Roy was there, swinging down from the horse at the gate with the ease of long habit, and he looked at her across the garden in the cold gray light of an October afternoon, and he said, "I told you I'd come back." "You did," she said. He walked through the gate and across the garden and took the squash from under her arm with a kind of gentle, unself-conscious familiarity that she found entirely disarming, and set it on the garden wall and looked at her with his hands at his sides and his expression entirely open. "Kraus is in custody," he said. "Morris has the case. It's going to trial in Dodge City in the spring. I'll need to testify, but for now it's done." "That's good," she said. "That's very good. I've been doing a great deal of thinking on the road between here and Abilene and back again," he said. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking here," she said. "Is that so?" he said. "It is," she said. He reached out and took her hand, with the dirt still on it from the garden, and held it in both of his, and looked at her with that full, honest gaze that she had been thinking about for 17 days. "Hester," he said, "I am not going to tell you that this is simple because you already know it isn't, and you have a great deal of respect for accuracy. I am going to tell you that I have not felt this way about anyone before, and I have been in enough situations where the alternative was that I might not come back at all to be done with the habit of not saying true things when I have the chance to say them." She looked at him, at his strong, road-weathered face and his dark eyes and the silver badge and the dust of 300 miles still on his coat, and she thought about windows versus mirrors, and she thought about the spring wildflowers on the southern plains, and she thought about 2 people sitting on a creek bank with their hands laced together in the dying light, and she thought about what bravery actually required, which was not the absence of fear but the decision to go forward anyway. "Roy Langston," she said, "I have been careful for 3 years, and I intend to remain a careful person, because that is who I am. But I have been thinking about you for 17 days, and the thinking did not diminish with distance, which is the test I set for myself, and you passed it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was relief and wonder and a kind of tender, serious joy all at once. Then he laughed, a short, real, surprised sound. "You set a test," he said. "I told you I was careful," she said. "You did," he said. "I believe I told you that was one of the most compelling things I'd ever observed." "You did," she said. He stepped closer and she did not step back, and he lifted his other hand and touched her face with the back of his fingers, and she closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them he was looking at her with the full weight of everything he was. "May I court you," he said, "properly, with James's knowledge, because that's what's right?" "Yes," she said, "you may." He kissed her then, briefly, and with the same quality of careful, direct honesty that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back, with somewhat more than 3 years of accumulated careful restraint behind it. And the October wind moved through the kitchen garden, and the squash sat on the wall, and somewhere in the cabin James's boots crossed the floor overhead and came to the window, and then considerately withdrew. James, when consulted, had a quantity of opinions about Roy Langston which he expressed at some length over supper that evening. He wanted to know Roy's prospects, which were modest but not without substance. He wanted to know Roy's plans, which were in genuine flux, because the business with Krause had forced a reckoning with 6 years of living entirely on the move that Roy was in the process of navigating. He wanted to know, with the directness of a man who had watched his sister hurt badly once and would not watch it again without objection, whether Roy understood what he was asking for. "I understand," Roy said, with the equanimity that never seemed to desert him, "that she is worth more care than I have ever spent on anything before, and I understand that saying so in a dining room is considerably easier than demonstrating it across time. I can only tell you that I know the difference between those two things, and I intend the latter." James looked at him for a long time and then nodded, once in the way of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "All right," he said. "Then all right." They were married the following April, in the small church at Broken Creek, on a day when the spring wildflowers were coming up through the grassland, in exactly the way Roy had described, waves of yellow and blue, and a particular shade of red that Hester had not been able to name, but would be able to recognize for the rest of her life. The winter between had been its own story. Roy stayed in Broken Creek through October and into November, helping James with the final winter preparations, and spending his evenings properly in James's house, courting Hester with a combination of practical assistance and conversation that was both entirely traditional in its form and entirely unlike anything she had experienced before in its content, because Roy's idea of courtship involved telling her the truth about himself in increments, at the pace at which he had access to it, which she found more romantic than any amount of flowers or poetry could have been. In December, he rode to Austin to testify in a preliminary hearing related to the Doyle case, and the infrastructure of the ring Krause had been part of, and he was gone for 3 weeks, during which Hester received 4 letters that were precise and unadorned, and contained more genuine feeling per sentence than most people managed in pages, and she wrote 4 back that were better than she had known she could write. He came back before Christmas with a small package that he gave her without ceremony, and inside was a brooch that had been his mother's, a simple, lovely thing of silver and pale green stone that had no monetary grandiosity, but had the weight of being the thing he valued most that could be carried and given. And when she looked up from it, he was watching her with that expression she had come to associate with the particular way he paid attention to things that mattered to him. She wore it to church on Christmas morning with James and the small Broken Creek congregation, and afterward they walked along the frozen creek in the short winter light. And Roy said that he had been speaking with Captain Morris in Abilene about the possibility of a different kind of ranger assignment, something that would keep him in a specific territory rather than ranging the entire Southwest, something that could be based from a fixed location, which would be a significant change from everything he had known for 6 years, and he wanted to know her thoughts. "My thoughts," she said carefully, "are that I would not ask you to change the nature of your work for my sake." "I know you wouldn't," he said. "I'm changing it for mine. 6 years of constant movement is a thing I chose when it was what I needed. I'm not sure it's what I need anymore. And that's a shift that has to do with becoming someone who knows what a home could feel like, which is a thing I've been learning since October. She took his arm as they walked, the creek ice cracking softly in the cold, and she thought about that. A man who had been in motion for 6 years beginning to understand what home might feel like, and the fact that she was part of the geography of that understanding. James's land claim is on 160 acres, she said, but there are adjacent parcels available. The Hendersons are leaving in the spring, they told me so themselves. Their quarter section is right adjacent to James's. He looked down at her. Are you suggesting I file a land claim in Broken Creek? I'm suggesting that adjacent parcels become available sometimes, she said, and that people with foresight take note of such things. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I believe I am going to spend the rest of my life slightly behind you in terms of practical planning. That seems efficient, she said. It does, he agreed. I find it very appealing. The Henderson quarter section was filed under Roy Langston's name in February of 1880. The wedding was in April, as noted, and it was not a large affair, but it was precisely what it should have been. Honest and warm and attended by people who genuinely wished them well, which included James, who cried at the ceremony with the same total lack of self-consciousness with which he had cried at their mother's funeral, and Arlen Fitch and his wife, who had developed a warm feeling toward Roy after the business of the Krause investigation had been resolved, and Fitch had been formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and the Petersons from the neighboring claim, and a dozen other people from the settlement who had, over the winter, come to know Roy Langston as the ranger who had quietly become a member of the community. Captain Morris rode down from Abilene for it, a broad, weathered man in his 50s with a gray beard and a steady eye, and he toasted Roy and Hester in the church hall afterward with a plain-spoken warmth that made clear the depth of his regard for the younger man. I have been a ranger for 30 years, Morris said, and Roy Langston is the finest I have known. Miss Garrison, I trust your good judgment to make him stop being quite so lone and quite so difficult, and I believe both of these things are within your capacity. Hester had said, I am working on exactly that, to a room of people who laughed and a husband who looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, which was, at this point, quite a known quantity and entirely hers. The trial of Billy Krause took place in Dodge City in June of 1880, and Roy testified with the precision and composure that characterized everything he did, and Krause was convicted on 4 counts and sentenced to 15 years. And on the evening after the verdict came in, Roy sat on the front porch of their cabin, which was the Henderson place now converted to something that was beginning, board by board and day by day, to acquire the quality of home, and he looked out at the grassland and said, It's done. Hester brought 2 cups of coffee out and sat beside him in the evening air and said, Yes. My father would have appreciated seeing it finished, he said. I think he would have, she said. They sat in the evening quiet, and the grassland stretched away in every direction, and somewhere across the creek a night bird was calling, and Roy reached over and took her hand, as he did every evening, with the same careful, honest attention he had brought to taking her hand the first time. Their first child was born in March of 1881, a boy they named Thomas, after Roy's father. He came into the world on a night when the last of the winter's snow was melting off the south faces of the creek banks, and James was there, because he had developed into a surprisingly competent presence in a domestic crisis, and the doctor who had been sent for from Caldwell arrived approximately 40 minutes after Thomas did, which was fine because Thomas had been entirely decisive about the timing. Roy held his son in the lamplight of their bedroom with an expression that Hester, watching from where she lay exhausted and entirely satisfied, did not have a word for. It was not an expression she had seen on his face before. It was something new, something that had come into existence specifically in response to this new person, and it had the quality of something enormous encountering its own magnitude for the first time. Thomas Roy Langston, Roy said softly. He said it the way he said things he meant to keep. "Hello, Thomas," Hester said. Thomas, for his part, appeared to be considering the situation with a focused, slightly furrowed attentiveness that was, James pointed out from the doorway, unmistakably a family trait. Roy's ranger assignment by this time covered a defined circuit of the southern Kansas and northern Indian Territory border, working out of Caldwell with a small team of 3 rangers under the coordination of a locally based captain, which meant that his travel was regular and bounded in a way that the previous 6 years had not been. He was gone 4 days in 10, on average, which was still a significant absence and required the practical adaptation of 2 people building a shared life around periods of separation. But they had both been alone for long enough to understand the value of what they had together, and the returns were, in consequence, considerably sweeter than they might otherwise have been. Hester established a seamstress business out of the front room of the cabin, which grew quickly because Broken Creek was growing, and there was genuine need for someone with her skill. And within a year she had 2 women from the settlement helping her with the volume of work that came in. She made wedding dresses and Sunday dresses and work clothes and curtains and quilts, and she had a reputation that extended as far as Caldwell in one direction and well into the settlement community in the other. And she found in it exactly what she had always found, the deep satisfaction of work that she understood completely, and that served people in the concrete, unambiguous way that a well-made garment serves its wearer through cold and labor and ceremony. She and James were neighbors of the closest kind, with the creek between their 2 properties serving as a boundary that was nominal rather than actual. And he came to supper most evenings when Roy was home, and sometimes when Roy was away. And the 3 of them had the easy, particular warmth of people who have chosen each other rather than merely inherited the connection. James himself found happiness in the spring of 1882, when a woman named Clara Moss arrived with a group of settlers from Missouri and filed on a quarter section 3 miles to the south, and proceeded to argue with him about Kansas land law with an informed conviction and a complete refusal to defer to his opinions that he found absolutely irresistible. Hester was the first person he told, which she considered appropriate given that she had been waiting for something like this since the October afternoon she had arrived in Broken Creek and found him leaning on his gate post with the old before-his-time look of someone who had been alone with his own company for too long. Clara Moss had dark eyes and an opinion on every subject and a laugh that carried across 3 fields, and James married her in the fall of 1882 in the same Broken Creek church, and Hester made Clara's wedding dress, which was the finest piece of work she had ever done up to that point, a cream wool with a deep-cuffed sleeve and a fitted waist that made Clara look exactly like herself, which was the highest achievement of Hester's craft. At Thomas's 2nd birthday, in March of 1883, Roy came home from a 4-day circuit and found Hester in the garden with Thomas on her hip, and a particular expression on her face that he had learned, over 2 years of close attention, to read accurately. "Another," he said. "Another," she said. He took Thomas from her and swung him up to his shoulder in a movement that Thomas greeted with the enthusiastic participation of a 2-year-old, who has learned that this particular maneuver is always worthwhile, and he kissed Hester in the way of a man who has been practicing at the particular art of kissing his wife for 2 years and is entirely committed to continuing to improve. "Is Thomas going to have a brother or a sister?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but we'll find out." It was a sister, born in November of 1883 on a cold, clear day when the grassland was pale gold and frost-edged, and the sky was the impossible blue of the southern plains in late autumn. They named her Alice, for Hester's mother. She was compact and emphatic from the first moment, and she regarded the world with the focused attention of both her parents, and she was, Roy informed Hester the evening of the birth, the most alarming thing he had ever encountered, which was a serious claim from a man who had been drawing down on armed criminals for 9 years. "She's a baby, Roy," Hester said. "She's looking at me," he said, very directly. "She takes after her father," Hester said. "That's concerning," he said, and she laughed, genuinely and completely, in the way she had been laughing for 3 years now, without reservation, without the careful management of her own emotional exposure that had once been her primary occupation. The years that followed were the years of building, in every sense. The cabin was extended twice, first to accommodate the children, and then again, when it became clear that Hester's seamstress business had outgrown the front room and required a proper workroom attached to the back of the house. Roy's circuit work continued with the regularity of an established professional life, and he acquired a reputation in the southern Kansas territory that was specifically the reputation of someone who could be trusted absolutely, and who had the particular quality of making difficult things look simple through the application of thorough preparation and a very steady nerve. He was made a senior ranger in 1885, which came with additional responsibility, and more importantly, with the ability to shape how the circuit work was organized, which he used to build something in the southern Kansas territory that his father would have recognized as the proper expression of what ranging was supposed to be: protective and just, attentive to the communities it served rather than simply to the law it enforced. He dealt with the tensions between the homesteaders and the cattle outfits in the territory with the same quality of honest directness he brought to everything, which meant that he had difficult conversations with powerful ranchers about fencing and water rights and the legal status of the homesteader claims. And those conversations did not always produce immediate friendship, but they produced a consistent respect that eventually amounted to something resembling peace, or at least the functional approximation of peace that the frontier offered. James and Clara had children of their own, 2 boys in quick succession, and the Garrison Langston extended family became one of the defining households of the Broken Creek community, the kind of family that other people oriented around not because they were prominent in any formal sense, but because they were stable and warm and genuinely interested in the welfare of the people around them. Hester hired a 3rd woman to help with the seamstress business in 1886, a young woman named Priscilla who had arrived in Broken Creek with her parents and had a gift for the work that Hester recognized and nurtured with the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has been given a genuinely talented student. She was training Priscilla not just in the technical craft, but in the business management of it, the pricing and the client relationships and the ordering of supplies, because Hester had been making provision for the future of her work since the day she understood it was a real enterprise rather than a temporary accommodation. In the spring of 1887, Roy came home from a circuit that had taken him briefly to Dodge City, where the city had changed considerably from the cattle town wildness of its 1870s heyday into something more settled and civic-minded, and he brought Thomas, now 6, a small carved wooden horse that a craftsman in Dodge City was selling, and Alice, 3, a ribbon the color of prairie wildflowers, and Hester a packet of seeds for a rose variety he had found at a merchant's, described to him as suitable for the Kansas climate, which he acknowledged was probably optimistic, but which had seemed worth the attempt. She planted them along the south wall of the house, where the winter sun would warm the stone, and they took, against reasonable expectation. And by the summer of 1888, there were roses climbing the south wall of the Langston house at Broken Creek that had no business being there given the climate and the soil, and the general ungenerousness of the Kansas grassland toward things that wanted to be merely beautiful rather than useful. And Roy looked at them every time he came home, and then looked at Hester with an expression that said, without any ambiguity whatsoever, that this was what all of it was about. Thomas started school in the settlement's new schoolhouse in the fall of 1887 and applied himself to his studies with an intensity that his teacher described as remarkable, and that both his parents recognized as the family propensity for paying very close attention to things that mattered, simply finding a new domain for itself. He was going to be someone who understood things deeply, Hester thought. He was going to be someone who, when he made a commitment, kept it absolutely. Alice was something else entirely, explosive and joyful and entirely physical, running through the world rather than walking through it, and she attached herself to her father's leg each time. He returned from a circuit with a conviction that Roy found both touching and occasionally destabilizing, in the literal sense. She was, he told Hester, exactly who she was from the very first hour, which was something he deeply respected, even when who she was involved a great quantity of noise before breakfast. Hester, who had spent 3 years building careful walls around herself in Wichita, who had arrived in Caldwell on a wet October afternoon with a dissolving map and a very firm intention to feel as few uncontrolled things as possible, who had stood on the main street of that town in the aftermath of a gunfight with a ranger she had known for 20 minutes and felt something shift in the barometric pressure of her whole life. Looked at her husband and her children and her roses and her brother's homestead across the creek, and her friend Priscilla bent over the work table in the seamstress room, and the grassland stretching out in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky, and she thought. About the afternoon she had asked a stranger for directions. She had asked him how to get to Broken Creek. He had said he knew the road. He had walked her the whole way home, as it turned out, in every sense that mattered, and the road had been considerably longer and more interesting than either of them had imagined. And home had turned out to be a place that they had built together out of the materials that two careful, honest, once lonely people could provide when they finally, after sufficient evidence had been accumulated and sufficient courage had been assembled, chose each other. In the autumn of 1889, the year Kansas achieved its full state constitution, Roy filed the paperwork that officially converted his ranger status from active circuit work to a senior advisory and training role, which meant he would be in Broken Creek with his family for the majority of every month and traveling for no more than 5 or 6 days at a stretch. He was 38 years old. Thomas was 8 and Alice was 5, and the house had been expanded again, and the roses were on their 3rd growing season, and Hester's seamstress business had expanded to include a 2nd workroom. He told her about the status change on an evening in October, which she noted privately was the same month of year as when they had begun, the same angle of light and the same quality of wind off the grassland, and she looked at him across the kitchen table, where the remains of supper were still spread, and the children were in bed, and the lamp was burning with its warm, uncomplicated light, and she thought about the girl who had been so carefully defending herself in Wichita, who had arrived in Caldwell with a dissolving map and a determination not to need anyone. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Change the assignment." "I know," he said. "I wanted to. This is where I want to be." She reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it and held hers as he had always held hers, with the same careful, honest attention that had been the first truth about him she had allowed herself to acknowledge, standing in a kitchen garden in October with dirt on her hands and a winter squash under her arm. "Roy," she said. "Hester," he said. Outside the window, the grassland was settling into the blue early dark of the autumn evening, and somewhere across the creek James and Clara's light was burning, and somewhere further south, the lights of Broken Creek's main street were coming on one by one, the town that had been 30 or 40 people, when she had arrived becoming a real, settled living place with a school and a church and a doctor and 100 families, all of them in the middle of their own stories that were nothing and everything like hers. And in the Langston house on the hill above the creek, with the roses sleeping against the south wall and Thomas's carved wooden horse on the shelf above the children's beds, and Alice's prairie ribbon in the button jar on the dresser, and Hester's mother's Bible on the bedside table, and Roy Langston's hand warm and certain in hers, the story had arrived at the place all true stories work toward, without being entirely certain they will reach. Not an ending so much as a depth. A place where the roots had gone down far enough that the wind could come from any direction, and the thing would hold. A place where two people who had both been damaged by the particular betrayals that the world reserves for people who trust too fully had found between them. Something that required trust to inhabit, but repaid it at a rate that made the risk not just acceptable but, in retrospect, the only reasonable choice. She had asked him for directions. One wet October afternoon on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1879. He had walked her the whole way home. They sat at their kitchen table in the lamplight of an October evening 10 years later, and the homestead was quiet around them, and the children were sleeping their deep children's sleep, and the grassland was dark and wide outside the window, and Roy Langston looked at his wife across the table with the full weight of everything he was, and Hester Garrison Langston looked back at him with the full weight of everything she was, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, because all the true things had been said. Over years and miles and seasons, and they were still being said, in the ordinary and extraordinary vocabulary of a shared life built carefully and honestly, in the wild, wide, beautiful, difficult country that had been the road they both, without knowing it, had been walking toward home.